Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming today. Today I will be presenting on the life and music of Louise Talma, a 20th century American composer. Talma was a pioneer among women, with many firsts in her career. She was the first woman to receive the Guggenheim Fellowship 2 years in a row, and she received many other awards in her lifetime. Her opera, The Alcestiad, was the first opera by an American woman to be performed at a major European theater. Even though her music was well received in her lifetime, her works are hardly performed today, and efforts to promote her music are fairly new. In this lecture recital, I hope to add to the growing body of research by highlighting the musical characteristics that unify Talma's works. Talma herself divided her music into 3 periods: the neoclassical period, the serial neotonal period, and the non-serial atonal period. But in each of these periods, Talma maintains a similar style that is uniquely her. I would like to highlight some of these stylistic similarities using 3 contrasting piano works by Talma. But first, who was Louise Talma? She was born to the opera singer Alma Cecile Garrigue. For unknown reasons, Alma changed her name to Cecile Talma sometime before 1900. This mystery may be related to the many inconsistencies in Louise's early records. Alma provided contradictory information at different times regarding Louise's birthplace, her birth date, and her biological father. What we do know is that Louise was born somewhere around 1906. She spent a brief part of her childhood in Arcachon, France, but she primarily grew up in New York City. Louise grew up in a strong musical environment. She received her first piano lessons from her mother at age 5, and she accompanied her mother in practicing opera repertoire throughout her childhood. Cecile also instructed Louise in solfege, as well as German, French, and Italian. Aside from music, Louise excelled in science and considered a career as a chemist before deciding to pursue a career in music. After graduating from Wadley High School for Girls, Louise enrolled in the Institute of Musical Arts, which is now Juilliard, in 1922. She studied piano and composition there for 8 years. Later, she earned a Bachelor of Music degree from New York University and a Master of Arts degree from Columbia University. In the summer of 1926, Talma entered the Conservatoire Américain in Fontainebleau, France, where she studied piano with Isidore Philippe. While there, Talma met Nadia Boulanger. According to Talma, she was persuaded by Boulanger to give up her piano studies and focus solely on composition. Talma likely embellished the story, possibly to help her legitimize her choice of pursuing a career as a female composer. At this time, female piano teachers were very common, but composition was a rare career choice for a woman. Regardless, Talma returned to the Conservatoire to study composition, and she spent every summer studying with Boulanger until 1939. Boulanger became one of the most important people in Talma's life. Talma eventually modeled her entire life after Boulanger, converting to her religion, devoting herself to teaching and composition like Boulanger had done, and even adopting Boulanger's style of dress, speech, and mannerisms. And to the left is a picture of Boulanger, and to the right is Talma. Boulanger's influence is most obvious in Talma's neoclassical period, ranging from 1939 through 1952. Neoclassicism can be defined as the adherence to the classic principles of balance, coolness, objectivity, and absolute music, with the corollary characteristics of economy, predominantly contrapuntal texture, and diatonic as well as chromatic harmonies. In short, neoclassical works combine classic principles of composition with modern techniques. This style was favored by Boulanger, and it was showcased in the music of Igor Stravinsky. Talma's early works feature many neoclassical tropes, such as the use of small-scale traditional forms, the use of counterpoint, an emphasis on rhythm, and the use of extended and non-functional harmony. The Pastoral Prelude shows many of these characteristics. It is a short work in ABA form. The A section features a contrapuntal texture, which is contrasted with the harmonic stasis that we hear in the pentatonic B section. This is the A section, and this is the B section. The piece features a restrained, sparse texture, as well as extended chords, chromaticism, and non-functional harmonic motion. You'll hear that piece later today. Boulanger influenced Talma's spiritual life just as much as her musical life. As Talma's obsession with Boulanger grew, she began to have more questions about Boulanger's Catholicism. After years of wrestling over questions and concerns about the Catholic faith, Talma was baptized in 1934 with Boulanger as her godmother. Talma later said, "Today religion is the basis of my life." After she converted, Talma wrote many sacred works throughout the rest of her life. She marked the beginning of these works with DG for Deo Gratias, meaning thanks be to God. In her works with sacred text, she often used meter changes to create contrast between sacred and secular themes. The Hound of Heaven, which was written in the early 1930s, is the first work where Talma does this. She uses triple rhythms and meters such as 6/8 or 9/8 to represent God, the voice of God, or desire for God. And she contrasts this with duple rhythms and meters such as 2/4, 4/4, which represent mortal secular themes. Some of her secular works also have sacred influences. The Alleluia in form of toccata is an example of this. Alleluia was Talma's first published work for piano, and it continues to be one of her most performed works today. This piece shows many of Talma's uses of asymmetrical ostinato patterns, static harmonic motion, and constant rhythmic movement. The main rhythmic motive that pervades the work suggests the word Alleluia, giving this work a joyful, speech-like quality. And here you can see the introductory section, which features bell-like octaves and suggests a call to prayer. In 1941, a rift began between Talma and Boulanger that quickly eroded their friendship. The rift started over some anti-Semitic comments that Boulanger wrote in a letter to Talma. While Talma wasn't Jewish, she was very offended by these comments and expressed her grief to Boulanger. But Boulanger rebuked Talma for trying to correct her and appealed to her authority over her as her mentor. Instead of backing down, Talma stood her ground and asked that Boulanger apologize for her comments. 1 year later, Talma's grief increased when her mother died. Just a few weeks after her mother's passing, Boulanger accused Talma of spreading rumors about her to damage her reputation as a pedagogue. This was a very traumatizing experience for Talma, as she lost the two most important women in her life at once. To make matters worse, Boulanger turned other mutual friends against Talma, so that many of them refused to even speak to her. In short, Talma was grieving and isolated from her community. A year later, in 1943, Talma went to the MacDowell Colony for the first time, which is an artist colony in Peterborough, New Hampshire. In the midst of a very difficult time in her life, the MacDowell Colony offered Talma the perfect blend of community and isolation. For the rest of her life, she spent most of her summers composing there, while she taught at Hunter College during the academic year. In an interview, Talma said, "I've been associated with the MacDowell Colony half of my life, and I owe practically my entire professional existence to it. I have made so many of my dearest friends, not to mention professional connections, which have made possible all the things that have happened since." And this picture is a picture of the artist at the colony in 1952. You can see Talma in the top row, third from the right. And next to her, on her left, or on her right, is Thornton Wilder, who she would later work with to write her opera, The Alcestiad. For Talma, solitude was a refuge. The colony offered the quiet solitude that she needed for composing. Talma explained, "In New York, I am constantly interrupted. There's the noise and there's the feeling of the neighbors whom you know you are disturbing by what you're doing, so to be able to get away from all of that is a wonderful feeling. I've written most of my music at the MacDowell Colony." And for Talma, solitude was a refuge from the busyness and noise of modern life. She did most of her composing in isolation, surrounded by nature, and this theme of solitude and quiet as an escape can be found in many of her compositions. Like her chamber opera, Have You Heard, Do You Know? And this is a picture of her studio at the MacDowell Colony. In 1952, Talma heard Irving Fine's serial yet tonally centered string quartet. Inspired by this work, she immediately began writing with serial techniques. Some of her works during this period are strictly serial, like her 6 etudes for piano, but in other works, Talma uses tone rows in a way that allows for some tonal centering, and she does this through the use of certain intervals, like perfect fourths or perfect fifths, as well as the use of repetition within a row and fragmentation of her rows. Piano Sonata No. 2 is a great example of how Talma combines her earlier style with her serial period. She wrote, "My second piano sonata was composed to unite tonal and serial elements in one work. In August 1944, I wrote the first 9 measures and measures 36 through 39 of the first movement, and the first 7 measures of the second movement. In January of 1952, I took it up again. By then, I had become interested in serial writing and did not wish to return to an exclusively tonal style. So I decided to combine them with a serial continuation and see what I could make of that. All the movements employ this procedure in some form or other, and we will come back to this sonata later." In 1954, Talma began working on an opera with Thornton Wilder based on his play, The Alcestiad. This was a long and arduous process for Talma, and she didn't complete it until 1958. The opera then premiered in 1962 in Frankfurt, Germany, where it was a big success. Initially, Wilder referred to the opera as a 12-tone work, but this intimidated Talma. For one, she thought calling it a 12-tone work would alienate the public. And 2, she worried that music critics and other composers would look down on her for her more relaxed approach to serialism. Talma herself was typically a bit critical of works that were entirely 12-tone. She felt that performers and even composers couldn't always tell when mistakes were made in performances. And Talma strongly believed that music should not be this separated from the actual sound being produced. After she completed the Alcestiad, Talma was a much more confident composer. The opera really stretched her and gave her the opportunity to refine her relaxed approach to serialism. Although she described her later period as non-serial atonal, she continued to use serial techniques in a similar way that she had in the Alcestiad. She once said, "I like to use serialism as a tool and to incorporate it with the other forms in music. I see no reason for chopping off what's developed simply because something new has come along. I believe in using all the tools available." Talma retired from teaching in 1979, but she kept composing for the rest of her life. In her later years, she focused on writing smaller works, typically for chamber ensemble, and in 1996, she died while in residency at the Yaddo Colony in Saratoga Springs, New York. She was composing a piece called The Lengthening Shadows, which is incomplete. There are 3 unifying styles that I would like to highlight in this lecture recital that unite all of her different periods and all of her piano works. Specifically, we'll be looking at Piano Sonata No. 2, which was actually dedicated to Thornton Wilder. And these unifying characteristics are her uniting of serial and tonal techniques. Although she didn't write with serial techniques throughout her life, once she did start to do that in 1952, she continued that through the rest of her life. Second, her use of block forms. She defines her forms through these block forms and specifically through texture contrasts. And you'll hear that today in the music that I'll play for you. Just a very clear contrast between the sections in that how she changes from one texture to the next very abruptly. A certain type of texture that she'll use is ostinato patterns. It's just a pattern that continues to repeat, and then that pattern will suddenly change at a section change. And then 3, her use of recurring piano techniques, specifically her use of toccata-like technique and Alberti bass patterns. And the 3rd main characteristic is her use of rhythmic character. She combines rhythmic motives that she will often repeat, so rhythmic repetition, with some rhythmic irregularity that adds interest for the audience and for the performer. And that irregularity may look like an asymmetrical rhythmic pattern, so a rhythmic pattern that covers 7 beats, or asymmetrical meters like 7/8, or it might look like mixed meter where she constantly is changing the meter of the piece. So the first piece that we'll look at is the first movement of the piano sonata. These measures, the first 9 measures of the piece, were written actually in 1944 during her serial, or during her tonal period. So these are strictly tonal, but she has a unique way of writing tonally. The right hand, you can see in this is the same example, just a little bit closer. The right hand outlines a D minor chord in octaves, and it continues to do that for several measures. However, the left hand, it imposes an E flat in the bass, which you can see that's the circled note in the first measure, and that note continues in each measure for several measures in a row. And E flat fights against that D minor tonality that she's implying with the right hand. So it's almost like the hands are in conflict with each other. So it's this tonal ambiguity. There's a tonal center that's implied through repetition, but it's undermined by chromaticism. So that section continues for several measures until we get to measure 31. So it continues tonally with lots of chromaticism. In measure 31, though, we have the first statement of the row. And the row is 12 tones, all 12 tones of the keyboard. And this is it here. And then it's followed by several other permutations of that row. Permutations just meaning that the rows are related to each other in some way, shape, or form. And both hands are actually playing in unison. So this is interesting. Once she breaks out of tonality, now the hands are actually in agreement with each other because they were in argument with each other for the first section of the piece. This first movement is also a wonderful example of her use of block forms and how she uses texture contrast to, punctuate or show her formal structure even more. The form is an A, B, C, B, A form, and at every section change, there's usually a large pause in the music and then a sudden change in the texture. So this is the same section you were just looking at, starting in measure 33, continuing on. All of a sudden, we have a large rest in measure 35, and then the texture changes. Also, the tempo marking changes to lento. So there's a tempo change as well, but that homophonic texture comes back in. And those 4 measures were also written in 1944 during her tonal period. So I'd like to play a little bit of this for you now so you can hear it. I'll play the first 9 measures of this work, and then I'll skip on to the measures 31 through 39. Movement 2 is also a sectional form, but it's a little more typical. It's an ABA form, and she combines the block structures with her use of tonal and serial techniques. So the first section is written in a tonal technique or tonal way, and the B section is serial. The first section also is a good example of her use of rhythmic regularity with irregularity. This particular section has a strong lilting feel. There is an eighth note pickup that constantly leads into a dotted quarter or a quarter note, and it gives it this lilting feel to it. It's very lyrical as well. But she gives a sense of irregularity to the rhythm with her use of constantly changing meter. So sometimes we're in a 6/8 pattern, which gives that lilting feel even more prominently, but other times she may change the meter. In the B section, we shift texture as well. So instead of being homophonic, chorale-like texture in the A section, starting in bar 20, which is the beginning of the B section, we have a contrapuntal texture, and it is also serial. A few bars later, 4 bars later actually, in bar 24, she uses a rhythmic pattern, and she switches back to a homophonic texture, but this rhythmic pattern that is repeated and that listeners will be able to identify, but it's not really related to her meter anymore. The piece is still in a 6/8, but the rhythmic pattern that she uses there doesn't seem to relate to the 6/8 at all. So again, a combination of rhythmic repetition with some form of rhythmic irregularity that adds interest for the listener. I'll play this short section for you now, starting in measure 24. Movement 3 is also in an ABA form, but in this particular movement, Talma combines serial and tonal techniques within the same section. This is the first 14 measures of the piece. She starts out in a tonal sort of technique with repeating the A. So she's, again, using repetition to imply a tonality. And also, if we take a little bit of a closer look at the first few measures, the left hand is also implying that tonality with an A, E, A bass line, which is a tonic dominant bass line. But again, she undermines that tonality with some chromaticism. She also combines that with a B flat, which is circled in the green, and then F, also circled in the green. So B flat, F, B flat. It goes against the A tonality and it almost implies a bitonality. Later on in that section, so this is the entire section, but later on she has the statement of the row. In both hands, the left-hand row is stated below, and then the right-hand row follows in parallel minor third or minor sixths. And then at the end of that row, she arrives at an A in the left hand and a C in the right hand, which also implies a tonal resolution. So again, she's combining this serial technique with tonal procedures as well. This is a great piece that is a great example of her use of toccata-like technique. In the very beginning section, you can see the short articulation, which is very common in the staccato articulation, common for toccatas. There are some rests in the very beginning of the A section, so it doesn't have that constant motion, but in the B section, we do have this constant movement of eighth notes, which is very suggestive of a toccata-like sort of technique. And there's also repeated notes in the left hand as well, which is also a trope of toccatas. So I'd like to play the first 14 measures of the A section for you so you can hear her combination of tonal and serial techniques. And then I'll also play the first 8 or so measures of the B section, starting in measure 28 there. The fourth and final movement is also in an ABA form. In this particular movement, Talma has these fragments of ideas within each section. So there are texture changes within the A section and within the B section. So it's a little bit different than the other 3 movements. Also, it's tonally more ambiguous than the other 3 movements as well. There are a few points where Talma implies a D tonality. On the screen, you can see measures 27 through 30. A D is played in the low register of the bass several times, which gives it this D pedal point and implies that D is the kind of the center. And at the very end of the piece, Talma cadences on a D harmony. In the right hand, it's a D major harmony, and in the left hand, it's a D minor harmony. So it's almost a bimodality there, but it alludes to the first movement, which was also centered on D. She also uses serial rows in a similar way that she does in the first movement. Both hands are playing the exact same row, but instead of playing them in unison this time, they're one note off. So the right hand, if you can see that, it's very small, but the first note of that first measure is an A flat, and in the left hand, the second note of that measure is an A flat. So they're 1/16th note off from each other, but they are playing the exact same row. There is a rhythmic motive that is identifiable in this piece and is the most identifiable thing within the piece, since it is a little more strange to our ears if we hear it for the first time. It's a 4-bar motive, and she does repeat it several times in the A section and in the return of the A section later. I'll play that for you in a moment, but really quickly I also want to mention the rhythmic regularity of the B section, which starts in measure 55. And in this section, it's again a lilting feel. So she's staying in 6/8 for the most part in this section, and she uses that 8th leading to a quarter note, that 8th pickup that leads to a quarter note. And there are a few moments, though, where she uses syncopation that undermines that lilting feel, which you can see that in the highlighted part, that legata la melodia. And the right hand is syncopated, so it almost goes against that 6/8 feel for a moment, which she does a few times in that section. So I'll play this first excerpt, measure 17, to show you that rhythmic motive that she uses, and then I'll play a little bit of the B section as well, starting in measure 57. To conclude, I want to say that Talma had many changes in her compositional style. She had lots of different ideas throughout her life, and she never really abandoned her former styles for new styles, but she kept combining things in a unique way. She maintains a similar style through her use of block structures, her use of rhythmic character, and her use of uniting tonal and serial techniques in the same works. And I think her music has a lot of musical variety because of this, and I think that it is accessible for students, young students. She does have some teaching pieces called sound shots for piano. I think it's accessible for audiences, and I think that it's very enjoyable as a performer to see all of these different ideas that she has. I would love to see her music performed more often. Thank you so much for coming to this lecture. I'll be playing the Pastoral Prelude, followed by the Alleluia in form of a toccata, which that prelude is joined together with the Alleluia. And then following that, I'll play the Piano Sonata No. 2. Thank you.